Sorry. What exactly is your preservation workflow in RICO?
So the publishers, this is on, right? So the publishers actually send us the content, and then we reformat it. We attach metadata at the point of ingest, and then put it into our preservation file formats, and then ingest it into the archive. So it's a different approach from LOCKSS, which is to go out and take it from the publisher's site and run it within the libraries. We're actually getting feeds from the publishers. That get at what you were wondering.
I'm interested to know, what is an ebook that is not linearly organized? I don't think I've ever seen anything like that. Can you give me an example?
Well, first of all, we actually should make sure that we are agreeing on what we mean by ebook here. So I tend to use it in the narrow sense of a file to be used on an e-reader. So a Kindle file, an EPUB file, as opposed to a book that's presented in a digital format, whatever that may be. So those formats today, like the ones that are out there, all require that you read that. They present the book from start to finish, and there's only one natural path through it. You might jump around as a reader, but it's clear where the start is and where the end is. If you ever read a Choose Your Own Adventure book as a kid, you know, you get this sort of book where you start reading it, and then it says, well, jump to this page or to that page. And the early hypertext people on the web were enamored by the idea that the web might allow this, and so they started creating things that can be read in more than one way. And these things, it was kind of an early web phenomenon that never caught on in a big way, but there are people out there who still produce such things. So there's this platform that I alluded to called Scalar, S-C-A-L-A-R. It's being developed out of as a sort of generalized infrastructure for what was used for the journal called Vectors, so also from the University of Southern California. And it, built into it, has this idea that there might be more than one vector through the text, more than one path through it. And so when you read something published using this platform, you can sort of work your way through it in different ways. Back there first.
Not a mic.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yep, okay. I wonder if any of you can speak to the importance of partnerships and replication, geographic distribution of content, and any complexities around copyright permissions respective to the content that you would replicate and preserve with various partners.
Do you want to start?
Go ahead and start, Kate.
Well, okay, so from the preservation perspective, as I said, regarding partnerships, I think it's really critical that we understand who's done what work already, and that we don't all feel we have to reproduce everything that's been done. And just the grant I was talking about is a case in point. I mean, we're working with a publisher that's arguably the one in a field, engineering, that uses more data than most, that's already had experiences with workflow and authors. We're working with the Data Conservancy at Hopkins that's already a data archive, and then we bring the preservation perspective to attack this big problem of the connection between data and the published version. Regarding replication, I'm not sure what you're referring to, but I can say that's one of the things built into the Portico model, which is that we have these replicas of the archive in various places, both a physical one and then in the cloud in various organizations and in different libraries in geographical regions around the world. So I think both of those things you brought up are very relevant to what we're doing.
Matt, I'm not sure if this gets at what your question is, but certainly the partnership model is one that's very important to library publishing, in that really every library publication is a partnership between the library and the faculty or student editor or author, and defining the roles and responsibilities of each partner at the outset of those projects is really important, and is something that libraries are still working out. What are the expectations, and how do those, it really is a negotiation, again, between the desire of libraries to support scholarly innovation and help scholars really push the boundaries of what they're doing, really accommodate the kind of work that they want to do, but with the understandings, as Kevin pointed out, that there are limits to what libraries can do if they want that content, what they're publishing, to be preservable over the long term, to persist, and to be accessible, be sustainable. And so those types of partnerships are really where I think libraries have a lot of natural connections with their faculty, and deep connections with their faculty, but they also have to negotiate in an environment where they can't always necessarily provide the best of both worlds in terms of innovation and sustainability.
Matt, I think you were going after wondering how a network like Clocks would work, or Locks or Clocks would work, when you have partners across boundaries with different copyright legislation. So at Michigan, most of the products of Michigan Publishing that were online were hosted in the University of Michigan's general purpose digital library infrastructure, which was all hosted at sites in Ann Arbor, and this wasn't really a concern. But we have been, because that infrastructure is quite old and limiting, we've been working on developing a new platform for publishing sort of directly into HathiTrust, which is a track-certified digital repository and a more robust infrastructure to work in. And so, as you've heard, there's this project that I was kind of helping to manage called MPAC for publishing open access journals directly into HathiTrust. And HathiTrust, of course, has partners around the world, and at this point has two storage sites that I'm aware of, in Ann Arbor and in Indianapolis, but they're both within the US. So again, we're not crossing national borders. That said, HathiTrust has a very different attitude towards copyright than many, and so there are digital copies of things protected by copyright, but not made accessible. And so the whole HathiTrust infrastructure is built with the assumption that you can tell the user's IP address and where they're coming from, and grant different levels of access depending on where they're coming from. And so even with a preservation network that was, say, built on the LOCKSS model, if you were operating under similar assumptions that you could make legal copies of copyrighted material, you could even store them in other countries and just be sure that you're only making them available to people in certain places. Start with John.
At events like this, I've noticed the definition of publishing feels very squishy to me. And 15 years ago it was make a codex and you've published, and now it's much more broad. I'm almost sensing a tension between, Kevin, you're kind of circumscribed. It needs to be text that can at least be consumed in a linear way, potentially. And Kate, your very expansive sweep of what potentially needs to be preserved, and am I allowed to use the word published as well? I'm not sure whether preservation equals publishing in this conversation or not. So I wouldn't mind if we could try and kind of clarify that a little bit. Is the mandate for preservation in digital environments broader than it was in the analog world? Which isn't to say obviously there's new tools that we use, but are you actually, now that we have digital tools, are you actually trying to expand what we preserve and publish?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think you actually picked up on a tension that exists, and I think Sarah actually gets to it in one of her questions. Balance. Kevin's also, how do we balance the need to innovate with the need to be responsible and realize that you have to be able to handle what it is you're inviting people to do. So from a preservation perspective, I think we have to be prepared to preserve whatever it is that the scholarly community moves, writing, publishing, and disseminating. I think that's the only way to be a responsible preservation. Our role is to serve the community. And as maybe I'm looking too far ahead, but I see the community moving toward these very different kinds of ways of expressing scholarly communication that will not be linear and that will not be in formats that we're comfortable with from the past. So yeah, I think our job is to try as best we can to be ready for that. There's a tension even for preservation services in that we don't, unfortunately, have an R&D division sitting across the hall in another part of the building ready to just do research. So we have to figure out, again, how you balance really having a small R&D group that's looking ahead while we're working as fast as we can to get the content in that's already out there that's not yet preserved. So I do see a tension and at working with others in tackle that.
I also agree that we should sort of strive to be ready for these things that are coming, but I'm, as probably, I mean, the view was coming through in the presentation, even though it's not mine personally, but I too am sort of willing to push back a little bit and say that we here, publishers and librarians, are specialists in this area and are thinking about preservation in a way that you, the scholar, may not be. And I think we might be able to sort of come to points of agreement where we say, you know, you say you want to do this really innovative thing, but you're going to cause more problems for yourself and for us in the future, so let's try to change this. I mean, to me, I just see analogies in terms of, like, you know, never allow the author to index their own book, right? And, you know, an acquisitions editor and a publisher is all about helping that author understand where their audience is really coming from, and so the editor plays that role of being the advocate for their eventual reader. And so to me, this is very similar. So I'm willing to push back a bit. But, you know, these things are all coming. I mean, there will be a day when people are more comfortable reading in nonlinear ways, maybe not, you know. So, like, we need to, so, you know, I mean, I'm not saying that these are going to be fixed forever, right? Like, I could see such requirements as I stated needing to be revisited in a few years. But that's kind of where we are at this point.
I just wanted to comment, too, that I think that the definition of publishing does really seem to be squishy or nebulous, as you said, John, but I think that doesn't mean that it's not deliberate or that there isn't some deliberateness with it in which we're trying to push the boundaries of what a publication means. I think, as we've heard from some of the speakers focusing really on open access and encouraging open access and the career arc of early career scholars and all of that, that pushing those boundaries and making sure that scholars are getting credit for producing data and for making that data accessible and putting their scholarship out there in new and different ways, that defining those things as publication gives them the type of legitimacy and credibility that they really deserve as contributions to the scholarly record and to the advancement of knowledge.
Yeah, next year. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Susie, yeah.
Thank you. Sarah, I was Susie Scomo from Bio1. Struck by your comment, reference to the traditional publishers and the issues that arise from their way of presenting the material. And I couldn't quite get my head around it, and I wonder if you could give some concrete examples.
Are you referring to kind of, I think what I was thinking of were the kind of examples that Peter Binfield was giving earlier, just in that there are these, that many commercial scholarly publishers are working within the confines of systems that create inefficiencies. Not so much the presentation, but in terms of the systems of having a sales force and having a warehouse full of print copies of a journal and things like that. And these are things that libraries are typically not doing. Libraries are typically working with much more lightweight, electronic-only models that certainly still have costs, but they're working in ways that are very different from what Elsevier is doing when they're publishing a journal.
Oh, thank you. I was imagining what you were talking about was the difference between, say, the print model that has gone online versus open access, which is opening up all kinds of options. But that wasn't specifically what you were referring to.
No, it was more the model for the production and distribution of scholarship, and just the idea that libraries are working within a different paradigm in a lot of ways.
Catherine?
So I just want to push back a little bit and maybe raise an issue around the library's role. So we're talking about preservation. We're talking about preservation of scholarly content in part in this session. And what I've heard are a couple of different things. One, that we need to meet the scholars. I loved what Kate said about needing to meet the scholars where they are. What they need to do their research, to disseminate their research, is what we need to be preserving. As a social historian, I know that if I were born 50 years from now instead of in this generation, the number one thing I'm going to be looking back and wanting is all of this innovative digital scholarship, experimental stuff that a lot of libraries don't want to touch. And I think the perspective, Kevin, that you're bringing forward is one that I hear all the time, and I understand it. I mean, I run a preservation, or I help to run a preservation network. I know how hard this stuff is. But I wonder, if not us, who? Because clearly it's not okay for us to be putting this in the hands of the Wayback Machine. That's not a library, A. B, it's dependent on Brewster Kahle and operations that we have very little control over. And C, it only gets a very thin layer of what we need to be collecting and preserving. And so I think about something like what Sarah Melton will be presenting on tomorrow with Southern Spaces, which has been a vibrant journal that's been published now for a decade, and that is as multimedia as Scalar and much lighter weight. And I wonder who's preserving that? Where does that go? And what is the library's role in doing that? And I'd love to hear you guys speculate on that.
Well, I think that's a great point, and I agree with you. If this gives us a headache, it's going to make everyone else just run as fast as they can the other way, because we're the community that's interested in this stuff and that spends a lot of time thinking about it. So I agree with you, we have to deal with it, but I also agree that it's probably more than most of us as individual organizations alone. So I'm really thinking about how, maybe I know in the commercial world this is illegal and stuff, but maybe we need to figure out how to divide up the problems and assign them ourselves, agree upon assigning them to different organizations to work on, and then maybe come back together and see where we are. This is all sounding very vague, and they don't have an org chart of how this will work, but that's sort of what I've been thinking about in the last year or so, to try and address these huge issues.
In the sort of policy I was articulating informally, this was intended for projects where there's an initial stage of discussion, it hasn't been created yet, we're working with a scholar and deciding whether we're going to give it the Michigan Publishing brand and then get stuck with preserving it. When there are great things out there being created anyway, and you or libraries say they need to preserve them, as you know, there are a number of institutions that have been doing great work with web archiving in a way technologically that's similar to what the Internet Archive does, and I think it's very valuable, important work. I do get scared about things like preserving sites that run on CMSs, like WordPress and Drupal and Joomla and all of these things, because of the difficulties of preserving that back end in that particular version, with that version, of everything down to the kernel behind it and all the difficulties there. And I think these are big problems. That said, you can do careful work to preserve the most valuable things. So just as The library has a conservation department that will do hand treatment of rare books. Some institutions have done hand treatment of the oldest, innovative, and most valuable projects, right? UVA especially, I'm preserving some of those oldest DH projects, back then, humanities computing projects, right? And it requires a lot of manual work to sort of migrate and preserve the content, and I can imagine doing that. But again, if you sort of come to the scholar and you say, like, right, if you create it that way, you're going to have to hope that it's valuable enough that somebody puts the resources into saving it. If you do it this way, we're going to be in a better place. So if you can make it work the latter way, I think we'll all be better off. So these are the conversations that I'm looking to engage in.
I also think we have to be willing to work with other communities. Might not normally think we have a lot in common. For example, the online multiplayer gaming community is doing research into preservation of these kinds of games and preserving both the software but also the social interactions that take place on top of it. And I know it might seem odd to think we have a lot in common with that, but I actually think we do. If you just flip that and think about the games as scholarly communication and the way it's evolving, and I think it would be interesting to have some panels or sessions where we put that community together with someone from our community to talk about the needs and the kinds of stuff that we're all trying to work with, because I think by saying we're just going to work with the same people we've always worked with in these areas might be limiting our potential for dealing with the kinds of issues you're
So a lot of your questions, I'm sure, perhaps came from and certainly remind me of the conversation that you and I and maybe some others in the room had in Barcelona last year at the ANADAP conference, and I get on open access publications preservation. And to the point up there, just a couple of, I guess, build-out questions. Even for things that are linear, like, traditional sorts of publications, one of the things that we were realizing in that discussion, and that's come out of Oya Rieger's, research, is that, for a lot of the publications out there, there's this huge gap, of Portico analogs, of things that are not being preserved anywhere, that are really at risk. And the interesting thing is, especially as we think about moving more into the open access model of publishing, is those same incentives that institutions have, whether it's Locks or Portico or something else, to preserve something they're buying, don't seem to pertain in the same way for open access publications. And so, yeah, who pays attention to preserving that stuff? Who pays attention to crawling those sites, preserving them? And that was a very interesting, challenging conversation, and I know you've thought a lot about that since, Kate, and we've had conversations about it back and forth, and I just wanted to let you speculate a bit more on that, and either Kevin or Sarah as well.